The coldest winter is never measured by snow, but by the hearts that refuse to open their doors. Night settled heavily over the quiet village of Ashwood Hollow as thick snow drifted across the empty streets, burying wooden fences and rooftops beneath a blanket of white that stretched toward the distant forest. A bitter wind swept through the narrow lane, carrying tiny crystals of ice that stung exposed skin and rattled every shutter it touched. Grace Sullivan stood motionless before the small farmhouse she had called home since childhood, her trembling hands wrapped around a worn wool blanket that offered little protection against the freezing air. Behind the sturdy oak door came the comforting glow of firelight, the sound of laughter, and the clatter of dinner plates, but none of it belonged to her anymore. Only moments earlier, her stepmother had opened the door just wide enough to throw her blanket outside before locking it again with a sharp click that echoed through the silent night. "You may sleep wherever you wish," the woman had said coldly. "This house is no place for a useless Omega." Grace remained standing for several seconds, staring at the closed door without knocking again. She had learned long ago that pleading never softened a heart determined to stay closed. Her father had passed away years earlier, and with him had disappeared the only person who ever called the little farmhouse a home instead of merely a house. She quietly pulled the old blanket tighter around her shoulders before turning away from the warm light shining through the window. Fresh snow immediately covered the footprints she left behind, as though even the winter itself expected no one to follow her. At the edge of the property stood an abandoned woodshed leaning slightly beneath the weight of countless winters. Its roof allowed the wind to slip through narrow cracks, but it offered enough shelter to escape the deepest snowfall. Grace carefully pushed open the weathered door and stepped inside. A stack of old firewood rested against one wall beside broken farming tools that had not been used in years. She gathered a few loose burlap sacks together before sitting quietly upon them, drawing the blanket around herself while listening to the storm outside. The cold reached her anyway, settling into her hands and feet despite every attempt to stay warm. Yet as she closed her eyes, she did not think about those who had shut her out. Instead, she silently hoped the elderly widow living 2 cottages away had enough firewood to survive the night. That was simply who Grace had become. Hardship had never convinced her to stop caring about other people. A faint scratching sound suddenly broke the silence. Grace looked toward the doorway where a tiny wolf pup, its white fur dusted with snow, stood shivering beside the entrance. One of its front paws remained lifted slightly from the frozen ground, and its frightened blue eyes watched her cautiously. Grace slowly smiled despite the cold. "You look even colder than I am," she whispered. Reaching into the small cloth bag hanging over her shoulder, she removed the last piece of bread she had saved for breakfast. Without hesitation, she broke it in half and gently placed one piece upon the floor a short distance away. The little animal hesitated before cautiously stepping forward to eat. Grace watched quietly, her own stomach reminding her that she had not eaten since early afternoon, but she never reached for the remaining half. Instead, she pushed that piece closer to the tiny creature as well. "You need it more," she said softly. The frightened pup finished the bread before curling into a small circle beside the wall, finally able to rest. Grace wrapped the blanket around both of them as best she could, unaware that beyond the snow-covered trees, a lone traveler wearing a simple dark cloak had paused his horse after noticing the faint lantern glow escaping through the cracks of the forgotten woodshed, and for reasons he could not yet explain, he found himself unable to ride away. Morning arrived without warmth. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the cracks of the old woodshed, casting thin beams across the frozen floor where Grace Sullivan slowly opened her eyes. For a moment she forgot where she was, but the sharp chill against her hands quickly reminded her that another night had passed outside the only home she had ever known. Beside her, the tiny white wolf pup remained asleep beneath the edge of her worn blanket, its breathing calm for the first time since she had found it. Grace smiled softly before carefully standing so she would not disturb the little creature. Her fingers had grown stiff from the cold, but she gently brushed loose snow away from the doorway before stepping outside. The village had begun another ordinary day. Smoke curled from warm chimneys. Neighbors carried buckets of water across icy paths, and children laughed while pulling handmade sleds through fresh snow. Grace quietly watched them for a few seconds before lowering her eyes. She carried no anger toward the life unfolding around her. She simply wished she still belonged somewhere inside it. The farmhouse stood only a short distance away, its windows glowing with welcoming firelight. She approached the back entrance, hoping only to collect the small basket she had woven herself before winter began. As she reached the porch, the kitchen door suddenly opened. Her stepbrother looked at her without surprise. "Mother said you are not coming back inside," he said flatly before placing the basket outside the door. "These are all that belong to you." The door closed again before Grace could answer. She quietly picked up the basket and found only a wooden cup, a sewing needle, 2 apples, and an old wool scarf that had belonged to her father. She gently folded the scarf against her heart before turning away once more. She did not knock. She did not beg. She simply accepted what remained and walked toward the village square. Near the bakery, several townspeople noticed her passing. Some looked away in uncomfortable silence, while others whispered quietly among themselves. An elderly baker stepped outside, holding a tray of warm bread. He hesitated for a moment before offering her a small loaf. "Take this," he said kindly. Grace smiled with sincere gratitude, but gently shook her head. "Please give it to Mrs. Harper instead. I heard she has been ill this week." The baker looked at her with quiet admiration. "You have very little yourself." Grace answered with a peaceful smile. "She probably has even less." The baker watched her continue walking through the snow, unable to understand how someone treated so unfairly still thought first about another person's comfort. Grace eventually returned to the woodshed, where the little wolf pup waited eagerly at the doorway. She carefully sliced one of her apples into small pieces, placing them beside a bowl of melted snow for the animal before taking only a few small bites for herself. As the pup happily ate, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed along the nearby forest road. Grace looked up to see the same lone traveler from the previous evening guiding a dark horse through the drifting snow. He wore a simple charcoal cloak dusted with frost, and nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or importance. When he noticed Grace, he politely brought the horse to a stop. His silver eyes rested briefly upon the little wolf pup sleeping beside her before meeting her gentle smile. "I hope I am not disturbing your morning," he said in a calm voice. Grace shook her head. "Not at all." The traveler glanced toward the abandoned woodshed and then toward the farmhouse, standing only a short distance away. Though he asked no questions, something in his quiet expression suggested he already understood far more than she realized. And as the cold winter wind carried snow between them, neither of them knew that this simple conversation would become the first step toward changing both of their lives forever. The traveler remained beside his horse, allowing the quiet winter morning to settle naturally between them instead of filling the silence with unnecessary questions. Grace Sullivan appreciated that. Too many people looked at her with curiosity, pity, or judgment, but this stranger simply looked at her as though she deserved the same respect as anyone else. The tiny white wolf pup wandered cautiously toward the horse before stopping beside Grace's boots, its bright blue eyes watching the visitor with innocent curiosity. The traveler smiled faintly. "It seems you have made a new friend." Grace looked down at the little animal and gently stroked its snowy fur. "I think we found each other." The traveler noticed the nearly empty basket resting beside the woodshed door. Inside were only a wooden cup, a sewing needle, one remaining apple, and a carefully folded wool scarf. "Have you lived here long?" he asked quietly. Grace glanced toward the weathered shed before answering with complete honesty. "Only since yesterday." She offered the words without bitterness, as though she were simply describing the weather. The traveler briefly looked toward the nearby farmhouse, where warm smoke drifted from the chimney. He understood enough not to ask another question about the house. Instead, he reached into one of the leather saddlebags hanging beside his horse and removed a small travel flask. "I made vegetable soup before leaving the northern road this morning," he said. "Would you share it with me?" Grace hesitated for only a moment before accepting the invitation. "Only if we both share it." The traveler handed her the flask, and she carefully poured the warm soup into her wooden cup before dividing the portion into 2 equal servings. She returned 1 cup to him with a grateful smile. "Thank you." The traveler noticed she quietly poured a few spoonfuls into a small wooden bowl for the wolf pup before taking a single sip herself. "You always think of others first," he observed. Grace lowered her eyes modestly. "Everyone feels the cold." The simple answer lingered in the crisp winter air. A few villagers passing along the nearby road slowed their steps after recognizing the stranger. His clothing appeared ordinary, but the quality of the dark cloak, the calm confidence in his posture, and the disciplined black horse beneath him suggested he was far more than a wandering merchant. They whispered quietly among themselves before continuing toward the village square. The traveler seemed completely uninterested in their attention. Instead, he asked Grace, "If someone opened another door for you somewhere else, would you leave this village behind?" Grace thought for several moments before answering. "I would never leave because of anger." She gently wrapped her father's old scarf around her hands. "But I would gladly walk toward a place where kindness is welcome." The traveler regarded her with thoughtful silver eyes. "That is a rare answer." Grace smiled softly. "It is the only honest one I have." The winter wind stirred again, carrying distant sounds from the center of the village where church bells announced the beginning of another day. The traveler slowly placed the empty cup back inside his saddlebag before preparing to continue his journey. "Thank you for sharing breakfast with a stranger," he said warmly. Grace shook her head with a gentle laugh. "It was your soup." "Perhaps," he replied, "but generosity is measured by the heart that shares it, not by who carried it here." Before mounting his horse, he looked once more toward the abandoned woodshed, then toward the farmhouse where its doors remained firmly closed. Without another word, he quietly rode away through the falling snow. While hidden beneath the sleeve of his simple cloak, a finely crafted silver ring engraved with the royal wolf crest briefly caught the pale winter sunlight before disappearing from sight once again. The stranger disappeared beyond the snow-covered pines, leaving behind only the faint sound of hoofbeats fading into the quiet winter morning. Grace Sullivan watched until both horse and rider vanished into the drifting white landscape before turning back toward the weathered woodshed that had become her shelter. The tiny white wolf pup trotted faithfully beside her, its once frightened movements now filled with growing confidence. Grace gently smiled. "I suppose we both survived another day," she whispered. The little creature wagged its tail before curling comfortably near the doorway. By afternoon, the village square buzzed with unusual excitement. Merchants abandoned their stalls to exchange whispered rumors while children ran eagerly between groups of adults repeating every new story they overheard. Grace carried a small bundle of firewood she had gathered from the forest edge when two women hurried past her. "Have you heard?" one asked excitedly. "The Alpha King may visit this region before winter ends." The other nodded enthusiastically. "They say he has been traveling across the kingdom without announcing his route." Grace quietly continued walking without joining the conversation. Royal visits belong to people with respectable homes, warm hearths, and families eager to receive distinguished guests. She expected nothing from such rumors. When she reached the farmhouse later that afternoon, hoping only to refill her wooden cup from the outdoor well, she found her stepmother directing everyone inside with surprising urgency. Fresh curtains were being hung in the windows, the front porch swept clean, and the dining table covered with the family's finest linens. Grace's stepbrother noticed her standing near the gate and frowned immediately. "Do not come any closer," he warned. "If the king truly visits this village, we do not want anyone seeing you near our house." Grace quietly lowered her eyes. "I only needed a little water." Without answering, he carried a full bucket from the well, poured every drop onto the frozen ground before her, then walked back toward the house carrying the empty bucket inside. Grace stood silently as the water disappeared beneath the snow. She could have felt anger. Instead, she simply picked up her empty cup and walked toward the public well near the chapel. An elderly woman waiting there noticed what had happened, but said nothing. She quietly stepped aside, allowing Grace to draw fresh water first. Their eyes met for only a moment before the older woman offered the smallest of smiles. Grace returned it with sincere gratitude. Sometimes kindness arrived without words. As evening settled across Ashwood Hollow, the village prepared for another bitterly cold night. Grace returned to the woodshed carrying a few extra branches for a small lantern fire outside the doorway. The wolf pup rested beside her while she carefully repaired a torn corner of her blanket using the old sewing needle her father had once given her. Suddenly, distant horns echoed faintly across the valley. They were not hunting horns or merchant signals. Their deep, steady notes carried unmistakable dignity. Villagers hurried from their homes, looking toward the northern road where small points of golden light slowly appeared through the falling snow. One by one, they realized they were watching an approaching royal convoy. Grace remained beside the woodshed, holding the frightened wolf pup gently against her shoulder, while warm lights from the distant procession reflected across the snow like scattered stars. Inside the farmhouse, her family rushed to straighten their clothing and prepare welcoming smiles, believing fortune was finally arriving at their front door. None of them noticed that the first rider at the head of the royal convoy quietly lifted his eyes toward the lonely woodshed before the village itself came fully into view. The royal convoy entered Ashwood Hollow with quiet dignity instead of grand celebration. Snow drifted gently through the evening air as rows of mounted guards wearing polished silver armor guided their horses along the narrow village road. Their banners, embroidered with the ancient silver wolf crest, moved gracefully above them, while the warm glow of lanterns reflected across the fresh snow. Every villager hurried toward the main square, bowing respectfully as the procession approached. Grace Sullivan remained beside the old woodshed, holding the tiny white wolf pup close beneath her blanket. She never imagined the royal visitors would notice someone standing so far from the crowd. Across the village, her stepmother welcomed neighbors into the farmhouse with a bright smile that had never been offered to Grace. Fresh bread filled the dining table, candles illuminated every window, and expensive dishes rarely used throughout the year now decorated the room. "The Alpha King must see that our family honors the crown," she proudly declared. Grace quietly looked away, choosing not to watch the scene any longer. She gently placed the wolf pup beside the small lantern burning near the woodshed entrance before gathering a few extra branches to keep the light alive through the cold night. Suddenly, the sound of hoofbeats slowed. One by one, the royal riders brought their horses to a stop in the center of the village. Every conversation faded into complete silence as the lead rider calmly dismounted. He wore a magnificent deep navy cloak fastened by a silver wolf clasp, and the legendary battle crown rested proudly above calm silver eyes that Grace immediately recognized. The simple traveler who had shared soup beside her woodshed now stood before the entire village as Alpha King Ethan Hawthorne. A quiet wave of astonishment spread through the crowd. Grace remained perfectly still, struggling to understand what she was seeing. The Alpha King acknowledged the respectful bows of the villagers with a gentle nod, but did not move toward the decorated farmhouse waiting to receive him. Instead, he slowly turned his eyes toward the lonely woodshed standing beyond the edge of the square. Without hesitation, he began walking across the snow. The royal guard followed several respectful steps behind, while confused whispers filled the village. Grace instinctively stepped back, believing he must be walking toward someone else, but there was no one behind her except the weathered wooden shelter. Ethan stopped only a few feet away. His calm expression carried the same quiet warmth she remembered from their shared breakfast. He smiled gently before speaking. "Miss Sullivan." Grace lowered her head respectfully. "Your Majesty." She could not find any other words. Ethan glanced toward the little wolf pup peacefully sleeping beneath the blanket before looking back at Grace. "I hoped I would find you exactly as I remembered." Grace looked down in quiet surprise. "I did not know who you were." Ethan's smile grew warmer. "That is precisely why I returned." Behind them, the villagers watched in stunned silence while Grace's stepmother hurried out of the farmhouse, her confident smile slowly fading with every step. She had expected the Alpha King to cross her doorway first. Instead, the ruler of the kingdom stood beside the daughter she had left outside in the middle of winter. Ethan looked briefly toward the closed farmhouse before returning his attention to Grace. "No one should spend winter without a place where they are welcomed," he said softly. The words settled gently over the silent village, and before anyone could speak, two royal attendants approached carrying a magnificent white fur-lined cloak embroidered with the silver wolf crest, while far beyond the gathered crowd, the towering gates of the royal palace awaited the decision that was about to change Grace's life forever. The white fur-lined cloak rested across the royal attendant's arms, its silver embroidery shimmering beneath the lantern light as every villager stood frozen in astonishment. Grace Sullivan remained motionless, unable to believe that the same traveler who had shared a simple cup of soup beside her woodshed now stood before her wearing the legendary battle crown. The tiny white wolf pup quietly curled against her boots, seemingly undisturbed by the gathering crowd. Alpha King Ethan Hawthorne accepted the magnificent cloak from one of the attendants before stepping closer to Grace. He did not rush the moment. Instead, he carefully lifted the cloak and gently placed it over her shoulders, replacing the thin, worn blanket that had barely protected her through the long winter nights. Warmth immediately surrounded her, but even greater than the warmth was the quiet dignity with which the gesture was given. Ethan looked at her with calm silver eyes. "Every person deserves a place where they are welcomed," he said softly. "No family has the right to take that away." The words settled over the village like the first rays of morning sunlight after a long storm. Grace lowered her eyes, overwhelmed not by the beauty of the cloak, but by the kindness behind it. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "I do not know how to thank you." Ethan smiled gently. "You already have." Grace looked at him with quiet confusion. Ethan continued, "When you shared your only breakfast with a stranger, you reminded me what true generosity looks like. When you cared for a helpless creature instead of protecting your own comfort, you reminded me what real strength is. And when every door closed behind you, your heart remained open." Around them, the villagers listened in complete silence. Grace's stepmother slowly stepped forward, forcing a respectful smile that could no longer hide her growing uneasiness. "Your Majesty," she began carefully, "surely there has been some misunderstanding. Grace is part of our household." Ethan turned toward her with the same calm expression that had never once required anger to command respect. "A household is not defined by walls," he answered quietly. "It is defined by the way people are treated inside them." No one spoke after that. Even the winter wind seemed to pause. Grace's stepbrother lowered his eyes, remembering the bucket of water he had poured onto the frozen ground rather than allowing her to drink. Several neighbors silently recalled watching her walk through the snow, while convincing themselves it was not their place to interfere. Ethan looked once more toward Grace before extending his gloved hand. "Grace Sullivan," he said warmly, "the gates of the royal palace will always remain open to someone whose kindness never depended upon comfort." She hesitated only long enough to gently lift the tiny wolf pup into her arms before placing her free hand in his. Ethan helped her step toward the waiting royal carriage, not as someone being rescued, but as someone being welcomed with honor. The royal attendants respectfully opened the carriage door while the silver wolf banners fluttered above them in the evening breeze. Grace looked back only once toward the old woodshed that had sheltered her through the coldest nights of winter. She carried no bitterness in her eyes, only quiet gratitude that even the hardest season had not taken away her compassion. As the carriage slowly began moving through the silent village, every person watched the rejected Omega leave beneath the protection of the Alpha King, while beyond the snow-covered hills, the towering gates of the royal palace slowly began opening long before she ever reached them, as though the kingdom itself had already prepared a place where she would never again be left standing outside in the cold. The journey to the royal palace lasted through the night, and by sunrise the towering white stone walls of the capital emerged beyond the last snow-covered hills like something Grace Sullivan had only imagined in childhood stories. Golden morning light reflected across tall palace windows, while silver wolf banners fluttered proudly above the ancient towers. The magnificent gates, carved with generations of royal history, already stood open before the royal carriage reached them. Rows of palace guards lined the entrance in polished armor, their heads respectfully lowered as Alpha King Ethan Hawthorne stepped down first before turning toward the carriage with the same quiet courtesy he had shown since the day they first met beside the abandoned woodshed. Grace carefully climbed down, still holding the tiny white wolf pup wrapped inside her warm royal cloak. She paused for a moment, overwhelmed not by the grandeur surrounding her, but by the realization that no one looked at her with judgment. Servants greeted her with welcoming smiles, attendants bowed respectfully, and every palace guard treated her with the same dignity they offered the Alpha King himself. Ethan noticed the uncertainty in her eyes and spoke gently. "You do not need to earn the right to be treated with kindness here." Grace quietly looked around the vast courtyard where fountains rested beneath delicate sheets of winter ice and evergreen trees framed elegant stone walkways. "It feels like another world," she admitted softly. Ethan smiled. It is simply a place where every door should open for those who deserve warmth. As they entered the palace together, Grace passed beneath soaring marble arches illuminated by sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Warm fires burned inside grand fireplaces, filling the halls with comforting heat she had almost forgotten existed. The wolf pups stretched happily inside her arms, drawing warm laughter from several palace attendants. One elderly housekeeper stepped forward with a welcoming smile. "We have already prepared a room for both of you," she said kindly while gently reaching down to pet the little animal. Grace blinked in surprise. "For both of us?" The woman nodded warmly. "His Majesty made certain no one in your care would ever be left outside again." Grace lowered her eyes, deeply moved by the thoughtful gesture. Later that morning, Ethan invited her to walk through the palace gardens where evergreen hedges, snow-covered statues, and frozen ponds created a peaceful winter landscape. They walked slowly without royal ceremony, speaking as two people rather than ruler and subject. "Do you know why I traveled through the kingdom without announcing my route?" Ethan asked quietly. Grace gently shook her head. "Because titles often change how people behave," he answered. "Kindness shown to strangers reveals far more than kindness shown to kings." Grace smiled thoughtfully. "Then I am grateful I met a stranger first." Ethan laughed softly. "So am I." As they continued walking, members of the royal council observed them from a nearby balcony. Several advisors quietly exchanged respectful nods, already understanding why the Alpha King had chosen to welcome the young Omega into the palace. They had read countless reports describing courage on battlefields and wisdom inside council chambers, yet very few stories spoke of compassion strong enough to survive rejection. Ethan paused before the palace's great entrance hall and looked toward Grace with calm sincerity. "This palace belongs to every person willing to protect kindness, regardless of where they began." Grace looked back toward the open gates standing far behind them and remembered the farmhouse door that had once closed against her. One door had shut her out during the coldest night of winter. Another had opened without asking anything in return. Standing beneath the warmth of the royal palace, surrounded by people who welcomed her with genuine respect, she quietly realized that the greatest difference between those two places had never been the size of their walls, but the hearts of the people waiting behind them. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the kingdom, and although snow still rested upon the distant mountains, warmer sunlight now spilled across the palace gardens each morning. Grace Sullivan had lived within the royal palace for several weeks, yet she still greeted every servant, every guard, and every visitor with the same quiet humility that had once carried her through the darkest nights beside the abandoned woodshed. Nothing about her kindness had changed after entering the palace. If anything, it had quietly grown stronger. She often spent her mornings helping the elderly palace gardener gather herbs before breakfast, carrying baskets that no one expected her to lift, and stopping to speak with young servants whose families lived far from the capital. The tiny white wolf pup followed faithfully behind her wherever she walked, delighting everyone it met. Palace staff soon began calling the little creature the happiest resident in the kingdom. One afternoon, Alpha King Ethan Hawthorne invited Grace to attend a gathering inside the grand hall where governors, advisors, village elders, and military commanders had assembled from every corner of the realm. Grace hesitated before entering the magnificent chamber. She quietly whispered, "I do not belong among people so important." Ethan looked at her with calm reassurance. Importance is measured by character, not by titles. Together, they stepped beneath towering marble columns while stained glass windows filled the hall with warm streams of colored light. As the meeting began, Ethan addressed the gathering with his usual quiet authority. A kingdom becomes stronger when every citizen is treated with dignity, especially those who have the least power to defend themselves. He paused before inviting Grace to stand beside him. Murmurs spread gently across the hall as many leaders recognized the young Omega whose story had already begun traveling throughout the kingdom. Ethan continued, "This woman was welcomed into this palace not because she sought favor, but because she never stopped choosing kindness when no one rewarded her for it." Grace lowered her eyes, visibly humbled by the attention. An elderly governor slowly stood before speaking. "Your Majesty, we have all heard what happened during the winter. Is the story truly accurate?" Ethan smiled faintly. "The story is incomplete. Curious silence filled the chamber. Ethan looked toward Grace. Many people remember that she endured rejection. He then looked around the hall. I remember that she shared her final meal with a stranger and protected a helpless creature while believing no one would ever know. Several council members quietly nodded. One village elder wiped away a tear before speaking softly. Those are the actions children should learn from. Ethan agreed. Exactly. Before the gathering ended, he announced a new royal initiative encouraging every village to establish warm shelters during the winter months so that no traveler, orphan, widow, or abandoned person would ever be forced to face the cold alone. The proposal received immediate support throughout the hall. Grace listened in quiet disbelief, realizing that one difficult season had inspired compassion far beyond her own life. As the council members departed, many approached her personally, not to praise her, but to thank her for reminding them of values that leadership should never forget. Later that evening, Grace stood beside the palace balcony overlooking the glowing capital while soft lanterns illuminated the streets below. Ethan joined her in comfortable silence before saying, "Sometimes people believe kingdoms are changed by great victories." Grace smiled gently as she watched families walking together beneath the evening lights. Perhaps they are changed by small kindnesses remembered for a very long time. Ethan nodded with quiet admiration, knowing the palace gates had opened for one young Omega. But through her example, countless other doors across the kingdom had already begun opening for people who had once believed no place would ever welcome them. Spring arrived in full bloom, transforming the kingdom with fields of wildflowers, clear rivers, and gentle breezes that carried the promise of new beginnings. Months had passed since Grace Sullivan first crossed the gates of the royal palace. Yet she remained the same humble Omega who had once shared her last piece of bread with a frightened wolf pup inside an abandoned woodshed. Every morning, she greeted palace servants by name, visited the royal kitchens to help prepare meals for travelers and the elderly, and quietly reminded everyone around her that kindness became stronger when practiced every day instead of only during extraordinary moments. The tiny white wolf pup had grown into a healthy young companion that wandered freely through the palace gardens, happily welcomed by guards, gardeners, and children alike. Throughout the kingdom, the Winter Shelter Initiative announced by Alpha King Ethan Hawthorne had begun changing countless lives. Every village established warm houses where travelers, widows, orphans, and anyone without a safe place could find food, blankets, and friendly faces. People often spoke about the wisdom of the Alpha King, but Ethan always redirected the praise toward the quiet Omega whose compassion had inspired the idea. One bright afternoon, he invited Grace to stand beside him on the palace balcony overlooking the capital as hundreds of citizens gathered below for the annual spring festival. Families filled the streets with music, colorful banners, and laughter while children released white doves into the clear blue sky. Ethan addressed the crowd with calm confidence. A kingdom is remembered not only for the strength of its walls, but for the kindness waiting behind its doors. Warm applause echoed across the city before he turned toward Grace. Many of you have heard stories about this remarkable woman, he continued. What you may not know is that she never asked for recognition. She only chose compassion when no one was watching. Grace felt her cheeks grow warm as she looked across the smiling faces below. She saw elderly villagers wrapped in warm cloaks, children holding fresh flowers, travelers welcomed without suspicion, and palace guards speaking kindly with ordinary citizens. The changes surrounding her were not the result of power alone. They had grown from countless small decisions made by people who had chosen to treat one another with dignity. Among the crowd, she quietly recognized the baker who had once offered her bread, the elderly woman who had silently stepped aside at the village well, and even her former neighbors from Ashwood Hollow. They no longer remembered her as the rejected Omega left outside during winter. They remembered her as someone who never allowed hardship to steal her compassion. Grace looked toward Ethan with sincere gratitude. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "you opened the palace gates for me." Ethan gently shook his head. "No, Grace. You opened them yourself the day you refused to let cruelty close your heart." His words remained with her long after the festival ended. As evening sunlight painted the palace towers in shades of gold, Grace walked peacefully through the blooming gardens with the young wolf at her side, reflecting on the long winter that had once seemed endless. She realized the greatest miracle had never been entering a magnificent palace. The true miracle was discovering that kindness could survive rejection, warmth could follow the coldest season, and one compassionate heart could quietly transform an entire kingdom without ever seeking reward. Beyond the open palace gates, travelers continued arriving from distant villages, each welcomed with the same dignity Grace had once received, and beneath the silver wolf banners fluttering gently in the spring breeze, her story lived on as a timeless reminder that the strongest doors are not built from stone or iron, but from hearts that choose to remain open even after enduring the harshest winter.